The rain was relentless that night, drumming against the windows like a warning. I sat in my study, the warmth of the desk lamp doing little to thaw the cold knot in my stomach. Life was supposed to feel settled by now. A comfortable marriage, a brilliant 16-year-old daughter, and a steady job at the manufacturing firm I'd poured years into. But lately, something felt off. My wife, Clara, had become a ghost in our home. Always on her phone, her laughter, a sound I used to cherish, sounded hollow when it was shared with anyone but me. I told myself I was imagining things, that she was just caught up in her own world. Stress, maybe? Everyone carried it differently. Then there was Sophie, our daughter, a bundle of confidence and teenage mischief. She'd recently started dating a boy named Evan. He was tall, polished, and came from old money, the kind of guy who could order wine in French without flinching. Clara had taken a shine to him right away, much to Sophie's embarrassment. She often teased her mom about stealing her boyfriend, but I'd laugh it off. Sophie had no idea how ironic her jokes would eventually become. That evening, I heard the familiar hum of Clara's laughter from downstairs. I peered out of the study, watching her from the banister. She stood in the kitchen with Evan, their voices low, their conversation fluid. It wasn't unusual for him to stop by, but something about the way they leaned toward each other set my nerves on edge. Clara's hand rested on the counter. Her nails painted the pale pink she'd worn when we first met. It used to be for me. Before I could dwell too long, Sophie bounded in with her usual whirlwind energy. Her messy ponytail swung as she gave Evan a playful shove. "Don't hog my mom," she teased. "I know she's prettier than me, but you're supposed to be here for me, remember?" Evan chuckled, effortlessly charming as always. "You caught me. I can't resist the cooking lessons. I'm making you cook next time." Sophie shot back, dragging him toward the living room. Clara stayed behind, her smile lingering long after they'd left. Something twisted in my chest. Later that night, I asked Clara about it. "Evan's quite the regular around here," I said casually as we climbed into bed. "You've really taken a liking to him, huh?" She shrugged, pulling the blanket over her shoulder. "He's good for Sophie. A real gentleman." "Why do you ask?" I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. "No reason," I lied. Clara closed her eyes, and I stared at the ceiling, my doubts growing louder with each passing second. Little did I know, my entire world was about to crack open. The days that followed felt like walking on cracked ice. Clara's behavior was harder to ignore now that suspicion had wormed its way into my mind. Every small interaction, every shared glance between her and Evan, felt like it carried a weight I couldn't explain. It was maddening, watching for something I couldn't yet prove. I decided to focus on Sophie instead. My daughter had always been my anchor. Her laughter could pull me out of even the darkest places. That Friday, I suggested a father-daughter movie night. Just the two of us. She lit up at the idea, even as she teased me for always picking boring old movies. The evening was going well until halfway through the second film. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, and I glanced at the screen. It was Clara. "Out late with friends. Don't wait up." I frowned. Friends? Clara wasn't exactly the social butterfly these days. She'd grown distant from her usual crowd, saying she preferred to keep to herself. So, who was she meeting now? I glanced at Sophie, engrossed in the movie, and forced a smile. "Want popcorn?" I asked, standing before she could notice my unease. While the microwave whirred in the kitchen, I stared out the window into the cold, dark street. The question buzzed like static in my mind. If she wasn't out with friends, where was she? And more importantly, who was she with? The next morning, Clara was already up by the time I came downstairs. She was humming to herself, a rare sight these days, as she flipped pancakes on the stove. The smell of butter and syrup filled the kitchen, masking the tension I carried from the night before. "Morning," I greeted, watching her carefully. "Morning," she replied brightly, her cheeriness almost forced. "I figured I'd treat everyone today. You're always cooking. Everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Why wouldn't it be? She said, flipping another pancake onto a growing stack. Her smile was too wide, her eyes darting away just long enough for me to notice. Sophie came downstairs moments later, her nose leading her straight to the kitchen. Wow, Mom's cooking? Who are you, and what have you done with Clara? Clara laughed, but I saw the momentary flicker in her eyes. Sophie's playful jab had hit closer to home than she realized. Evan arrived around noon, as he often did. He greeted Sophie with a kiss on the cheek and a bouquet of daisies, her favorite. But what caught my attention was how his gaze lingered on Clara when she stepped into the room. It wasn't obvious, just a fraction too long, but it was enough to set my teeth on edge. You're spoiling her, Evan, Clara said, smiling as she admired the flowers. Only the best for your daughter, he replied smoothly, though his smile seemed broader when it landed on Clara. I excused myself to the study, needing a moment to think. As I sat at my desk, I noticed the way my hand trembled as I reached for my pen. Was I being paranoid? Was I inventing problems that didn't exist? I didn't have long to stew in my thoughts. A knock at the door interrupted me, and Sophie poked her head in. Dad, can you believe this guy? He's trying to convince me I should wear heels to his cousin's wedding. Like I'm some kind of pageant girl, she said, rolling her eyes. I laughed softly, grateful for the distraction. You've never needed heels to stand tall, kiddo. Tell him to deal with it. Already did. She grinned. Thanks, Dad. Her words should have lightened my mood, but they didn't. The pieces in my mind were shifting, and no matter how I tried, I couldn't push them back into place. Later that evening, as the house settled into its usual quiet rhythm, I walked into the kitchen for a glass of water. Clara was there, scrolling through her phone, her back to me. Clara, I said, leaning against the counter. She turned, startled. What is it? Just wondering, how are things? She blinked, the question catching her off guard. Things are fine. Why? No reason, I said quickly, waving it off. You seemed happier lately, that's all. Her lips tightened for a moment before she forced a smile. I guess I've just been finding little joys. It's nothing to worry about. But I was worried. Because for the first time in our marriage, her happiness felt like something I wasn't a part of. And the feeling wouldn't let me go. It was a Saturday afternoon when everything fell apart. Sophie had gone to the mall with her friends, leaving the house eerily quiet. Clara was in the living room, scrolling through her phone as she often did lately. I was in the kitchen, staring at the list of household repairs I'd been putting off, when I heard her laugh. It wasn't the polite, half-hearted laugh I'd grown used to. It was full-bodied and warm, the kind I hadn't heard in months. I peeked into the living room, curious. Clara was leaning back on the couch, her phone tilted slightly away from view, her expression glowing. For a moment, I could almost believe things were normal. But then her phone chimed, and I saw the flicker of guilt cross her face as she swiped the screen. Who's that? I asked, stepping into the room. Her head snapped up, her fingers fumbling to lock the phone. What? She asked, her voice too casual. On your phone. You seem happy, I said, keeping my tone neutral. It's just Sophie, she said quickly, flashing me a tight smile. She sent me a funny picture from the mall. A lie. I knew Sophie well enough to know she wasn't one for sharing jokes over text. Something in Clara's tone, in her body language, confirmed it. I didn't press her then. Instead, I waited until she went upstairs to take a shower. My heart pounded as I walked over to the couch where she'd left her phone charging. This wasn't something I ever imagined doing, snooping through my wife's private messages, but the weight of doubt was crushing me. Unlocking the phone wasn't hard. I knew her passcode by heart. I hesitated for a moment before opening her messages. The first name at the top of the list froze me in place. Evan. My breath caught in my throat as I opened the chat. The texts were casual at first, harmless enough. Thanks for dropping by. You always brighten the house. You're so thoughtful, Evan. Sophie's lucky to have you. But then the tone shifted, becoming something else entirely. I can't stop thinking about our conversation yesterday. You really understand me in a way no one else does. Sometimes I feel like I can only be myself when I'm around you. Are you free to stop by tomorrow? I can't wait to see you. My hands shook as I scrolled through the thread, the pit in my stomach growing deeper with every line. There were no explicit confessions, no blatant declarations of an affair, but the intimacy in their words was undeniable. And then, one message from Evan hit me like a freight train. We need to talk about how we're going to handle Sophie. She's going to figure it out eventually. I felt the room spin as the implications settled in. My wife wasn't just emotionally involved with Sophie's boyfriend, she was planning something with him. A wave of anger and humiliation surged through me, hot and all-consuming. I locked the phone and set it back on the couch, pacing the room as my mind raced. Every moment of the past few months replayed in my head, all the signs I'd ignored or brushed aside. Clara's late nights. Her sudden cheerfulness. Evan's lingering presence in our home. I felt sick. When Clara came back downstairs, her hair damp and her expression carefree, I couldn't look at her the same way. "Everything okay?" she asked, noticing my tension. I forced a smile, masking the storm inside me. "Yeah," I said quietly. "Everything's fine." But everything was far from fine. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized there was no coming back from this. Clara and Evan had crossed a line, one that I couldn't ignore. But I wasn't going to confront them yet. I needed a plan, a way to make them pay for what they'd done without tearing Sophie apart in the process. The betrayal had been planted, and now it was growing into something dark and unrelenting. They thought they could get away with it. They were wrong. The next morning, the house was quiet. Clara had taken Sophie to her weekend soccer game, leaving me alone with my thoughts and my anger. I couldn't sit still. Every time I replayed the messages in my head, it felt like a fresh wound, a betrayal carved deeper into my chest. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about Sophie. How could Clara and Evan do this, knowing it would shatter her? The thought of my daughter being caught in the middle of their lies only fueled the fire in me. I needed to think, but more than that, I needed evidence, something concrete to confront them with. Something that would force them to face what they'd done. I started by checking the phone records. Clara and I shared a family plan, and it didn't take long to find the pattern. Dozens of calls and texts exchanged between her and Evan at all hours of the day. The timeline matched perfectly with when she'd started acting distant, with Evan's frequent visits to our home. Next, I went to the garage and retrieved an old motion-activated camera I used to use for work projects. It was discreet, no bigger than my fist, and could be hidden in plain sight. I set it up in the living room, nestled among the books on the shelf, aimed at the couch where Clara and Evan seemed to spend most of their time. I wasn't proud of spying on my wife, but pride wasn't part of this equation anymore. I needed the truth, raw and unfiltered. By the time Clara and Sophie returned, I was sitting at the dining table, pretending to read the paper. Sophie was bubbling with excitement about her game, her laughter filling the house like a bomb I didn't deserve. Clara smiled, playing the role of the perfect mother, but all I could see was her betrayal. "You okay, Dad?" Sophie asked, pausing as she noticed my silence. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, mustering the best smile I could. "Just tired, that's all." She gave me a curious look but shrugged it off, retreating upstairs to change out of her soccer gear. Clara caught my eye as she moved to the kitchen. "You seemed a little off earlier. Are you sure everything's okay?" she asked, her voice dripping with false concern. "Fine," I said curtly, my gaze piercing hers. "Just thinking about some work stuff." She hesitated, her expression faltering for a moment, but then she nodded and busied herself with dinner. Every word out of her mouth now sounded like a lie. The camera proved its worth faster than I anticipated. A few days later, I checked the footage, my hands trembling as I scrolled through the recordings. And there it was, Clara and Evan, sitting too close on the couch, laughing, their conversation casual at first. Then, Evan leaned in, his hand brushing hers. "Don't," Clara said softly, but there was no conviction in her voice. It's fine, Evan replied, his tone confident. No one will find out. Clara hesitated but didn't pull away. I stopped the video, unable to watch anymore. My vision blurred with rage, but alongside it was something colder: calculation. I wasn't going to explode. That would give them too much satisfaction. No, I was going to dismantle their little fantasy piece by piece, and they'd never see it coming. The first step was isolating Sophie from the fallout. I couldn't risk her being hurt any more than she already would be. That evening, I told her I wanted to take her on a weekend trip, just the two of us. Really? She said, her face lighting up. What's the occasion? No occasion, I replied, ruffling her hair. Just thought we could use some quality time. Cool. Can we go hiking? Maybe stay at that cabin we used to visit? Absolutely, I said, forcing a smile. We'll leave Friday after school. Clara overheard and tried to insert herself into the plan. What about me? She asked, feigning disappointment. I shrugged. I figured you'd enjoy some quiet time at home for a change. She frowned, but she didn't argue. By the time Friday rolled around, Sophie and I were on the road, her laughter and chatter filling the car. I kept the conversation light, avoiding anything that might tip her off to what was brewing under the surface. Clara, meanwhile, thought she had the house to herself. She didn't realize I'd left the camera rolling. When Sophie and I returned late Sunday afternoon, I reviewed the footage immediately. It was worse than I'd imagined. Evan had been at the house both nights, staying late into the evening. The recordings showed them laughing, talking, sharing moments that should have been reserved for us. Clara had traded years of marriage for this, the thrill of stolen moments with a boy young enough to be her son-in-law. It was disgusting. But now I had what I needed. That night I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in years, Clara's brother, Mark. He'd always been protective of her, but he was also fiercely loyal to the idea of family. If there was anyone who'd understand the severity of what was happening, it was him. Ryan? He said when he picked up, his voice wary. What's going on? You don't usually call. I need your help, I said, my voice grim. It's about Clara. And it's bad. Over the next half hour, I laid everything out, the texts, the footage, the lies. Mark was silent for most of it, but I could hear his breathing grow heavier as the story unfolded. You're sure about this? He finally asked. I wish I wasn't, I replied. But I have proof. And Sophie's at risk of being dragged into their mess. Mark sighed heavily. Tell me what you need. Support, I said. When this comes out, it's going to tear our family apart. I need someone to back me up. You have it, Mark said firmly. Whatever you need, I'm here. With Mark on my side, I felt a glimmer of reassurance. Clara and Evan thought they had the upper hand, but they were about to learn just how wrong they were. They'd played their game. Now it was my turn. The storm I'd been holding back was starting to build, and it wouldn't be long before it hit. Clara's betrayal wasn't just a personal wound, it was a rot that threatened to poison everything I'd worked so hard to build for Sophie and me. It was time to act. But I couldn't act impulsively. If Clara and Evan thought they could manipulate and scheme behind closed doors, then I needed to show them I wasn't a fool. They didn't deserve a confrontation, they deserved exposure. The first step was simple: preparation. I spent the next few days gathering everything I had, footage from the camera, the text messages, and the phone records. Every damning piece of evidence was saved, catalogued, and copied. I wasn't going to give Clara a chance to deny what she'd done. Mark, true to his word, stayed in constant contact. He was livid when I showed him the footage. She's lost her mind, he said, pacing in my kitchen. And Evan? He's a kid. What the hell does he think he's doing? He thinks he's untouchable, I replied. Clara's feeding that delusion. But not for long. Mark's jaw tightened. What's your plan? You'll see soon enough, I said. The second step was harder, keeping Sophie in the dark. She'd always been a perceptive kid, and it was only a matter of time before she started picking up on the tension between Clara and me. I couldn't let her get hurt any more than she already would be. For now, I pretended everything was fine. I smiled when I didn't want to, laughed when it felt like my chest was caving in, and focused on giving Sophie as much stability as I could. Clara, meanwhile, seemed blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. She carried on as if nothing had changed, her smiles too bright, her words too carefully chosen. I caught her texting late at night, her phone clutched tightly to her chest whenever I walked into the room. She thought she was being clever. She thought I was too blind to see the truth. She thought wrong. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. It was a Friday night, and Sophie had gone to a sleepover at her best friend's house. Clara seemed unusually upbeat as she set the table for dinner, humming softly to herself. I watched her from across the room, my anger simmering just beneath the surface. "We don't get enough nights like this," she said, placing 2 plates on the table. "Just the 2 of us." I replied, non-committal. She glanced at me, a flicker of nervousness crossing her face. "You okay? You've been quiet lately." I stared at her, my fork resting on the edge of my plate. "I'm fine," I said. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how people can lie to the ones they're supposed to love." The words hung in the air like a blade. Clara froze, her hand tightening around her glass. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "You tell me," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Do you think I'm blind, Clara? Do you think I haven't noticed the way you've been acting?" Her face paled. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," I snapped, my voice rising. "I've seen the messages, Clara. I've seen the footage. I know everything." Her mouth opened, then closed again, her face crumpling as the weight of her lies crashed down around her. "Ryan, I can explain." "Don't you dare," I interrupted, my voice cold and sharp. "You've been sneaking around with Evan, of all people. Sophie's boyfriend. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Tears streamed down her face as she stammered. "It wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't mean for it to go this far." "You didn't mean for it to go this far?" I repeated, incredulous. "You brought him into our house, into Sophie's life, and you think that's something you can brush off as a mistake?" Her sobs grew louder, but I felt no sympathy. "It wasn't serious," she pleaded. "It's not what you think." "Stop lying!" I shouted, slamming my fist on the table. "I've seen the evidence, Clara. Every word, every touch, every moment. Do you think Sophie would forgive you if she knew? Do you think she'd look at you the same way?" She flinched at Sophie's name, her shoulders shaking. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Don't tell her. I'll end it, I swear. Just don't tell her." I stared at her, my chest heaving with anger and disgust. "It's too late for that, Clara. You've already destroyed everything." She tried to reach for my hand, but I pulled away, standing abruptly. "We're done," I said. "I've already contacted a lawyer. You'll be hearing from them soon." Her sobs filled the room as I turned and walked away, my resolve unshaken. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next step was Evan. And he wouldn't see it coming. By the time I reached Evan, I was running on pure adrenaline. Clara's tears and excuses had hardened my resolve. She'd made her choices, and now it was time to address the other half of this betrayal. Evan's role wasn't just unforgivable, it was a mockery. He'd sat at my dinner table, laughed with Sophie, and played the part of a doting boyfriend, all while sneaking around with my wife. He thought he could charm his way through life, but he was about to learn that not everyone played by his rules. I waited until Sunday afternoon to make my move. Sophie had gone out with friends again, and Clara had locked herself in the guest bedroom, her misery filling the house like a dark cloud. I didn't care. I had work to do. Evan had no idea I was coming. He lived in a sprawling estate on the edge of town, a gift from his family's wealth, and as I parked in his long driveway, I felt a grim satisfaction. This wasn't a home, It was a fortress of entitlement. I rang the doorbell, my hands steady despite the storm raging inside me. It took a few moments before Evan appeared, his usual confident smirk plastered on his face. That smirk faded the moment he saw me. "Ryan," he said, his voice laced with uncertainty. "What a surprise. Can we talk?" I said, my tone cold. "Or would you rather I do this in front of your family?" His eyes darted nervously to the driveway. "Let's keep it inside." He stepped aside, and I walked in, taking a moment to glance around. The house was as polished and ostentatious as he was, all marble floors and expensive art. It only made my anger burn hotter. We ended up in his living room, where he gestured for me to sit. I didn't. "You've got a lot of nerve," I said, staring him down. "Parading around my home, pretending to care about Sophie, while you're sneaking behind her back with Clara. What kind of man does that?" Evan paled, but he tried to hold his composure. "Ryan, don't," I snapped, cutting him off. "I don't want your excuses. I want answers." He swallowed hard, his usual bravado crumbling. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he said finally. "Clara and we just connected. It started small, talking about life, her frustrations, her loneliness." "Her loneliness," I repeated bitterly. "And you thought you were the answer?" He had the decency to look ashamed. "I didn't plan for it to go this far." "But it did," I said coldly. "And now you're going to deal with the consequences." Evan's face tightened. "What do you want from me?" "I want you out of Sophie's life," I said, my voice sharp. "Completely. No calls, no texts, no contact. You're going to break up with her, and you're going to do it in a way that doesn't hurt her more than you already have." His brow furrowed. "And if I don't?" I stepped closer, my glare piercing. "You've seen what I can dig up, Evan. The texts, the footage, I've got enough to ruin you. Your family's reputation, your career prospects, everything you've built your life on. If you want to keep any of it intact, you'll do as I say." He hesitated, the weight of my threat sinking in. "Fine," he said eventually, his voice low. "I'll end it." "You'll end it by the end of the week," I said. "And if I hear you so much as breathe Clara's name again, you'll regret it." Evan nodded, his confidence thoroughly shattered. I turned to leave but paused at the door, looking back at him one last time. "You think this is over, Evan?" I said. "It's not. People like you think you can take whatever you want without consequences. But there's always a cost. You'll feel it soon enough." I didn't wait for a response. I walked out of his house, leaving him to stew in his fear. That night, I returned home to find Clara sitting in the living room, her face pale and drawn. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Out," I said flatly, brushing past her. She stood, blocking my path. "Ryan, please. We need to talk." "There's nothing left to say," I said coldly. "You made your choices. Now you live with them." Her shoulders sagged, her tears starting again, but I didn't stop. I climbed the stairs to Sophie's room, checking on her as she slept. Her peaceful face was a reminder of why I was doing all of this. She deserved better, better than Evan, better than Clara, better than this broken mess they'd created. I kissed her forehead gently and left the room, my resolve stronger than ever. Clara and Evan thought they'd won, that they could have their fun and walk away unscathed. They were wrong. The days that followed were a delicate balancing act. Clara withdrew further into herself, her guilt and shame written across her face at every turn. Evan had kept his word and broken up with Sophie, but his cowardice showed in how he handled it. A brief, impersonal text was all he gave her, leaving her confused and heartbroken. Sophie wasn't one to cry easily, but when she came home that evening, her eyes were red, and her usually sunny demeanor had dimmed. I wanted to shield her from the pain, to tell her the truth, but I couldn't. "Not yet." "Dad?" she said quietly as I helped her unpack her backpack after school. "Yes, sweetheart? Do you think Evan really liked me?" Her voice trembled, and it shattered something in me. I knelt beside her, keeping my tone steady. Of course he did, I said, stroking her hair. Sometimes people just aren't who we think they are. That doesn't mean you did anything wrong. She nodded but didn't look convinced. It just feels so sudden. He was fine last week, and then, poof, it's over. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep my emotions in check. It's not your fault, Sophie. Sometimes people can't handle the kind of love you have to offer. She gave me a weak smile. Thanks, Dad. I guess it's better to find out now than later, right? Right, I said, though the truth weighed heavy in my chest. As Sophie's heartache lingered, Clara's anxiety grew. She tiptoed around me, afraid to say the wrong thing, but it didn't stop her from trying to talk to me when Sophie wasn't around. Ryan, we can't keep doing this, she said one evening as I cleared the dinner table. I didn't look at her. Doing what? This. She gestured vaguely between us. The silence. The distance. I know I made mistakes. Mistakes? I interrupted, my voice sharp. You didn't forget to pay a bill, Clara. You didn't misplace your car keys. You destroyed this family. Her eyes filled with tears, but I wasn't moved. I'm trying, Ryan, she whispered. Try harder, I said coldly, walking away. Sophie's suspicion began to grow not long after Evan's sudden exit from her life. She started asking questions, her sharp intuition piecing together fragments of the truth. One evening, as I sat in the living room sorting through paperwork, she joined me, her expression thoughtful. Dad, she said hesitantly, can I ask you something? Of course, I replied, setting the papers aside. Do you think Mom's okay? The question caught me off guard. What do you mean? She's been acting weird lately, Sophie said, frowning. She's always distracted, and she seems sad. Like more than usual. I exhaled slowly, choosing my words carefully. Your mom's dealing with some things right now, I said. It's not your fault. But is it about me? About Evan? Sophie pressed. No, I said firmly. It has nothing to do with you. Her frown deepened, but she didn't push further. I just want her to be happy again, she said softly. I know, I said, my heart breaking a little. And I want you to be happy too. Sophie nodded and gave me a small smile before retreating to her room. Later that night, I stood outside Clara's door, my fists clenched. Sophie's words replayed in my mind, her innocence colliding with the harsh reality of what her mother had done. Clara had no idea how lucky she was that I hadn't exposed her yet. But her time was running out. That weekend, Sophie came to me with an idea. Dad, let's have a family dinner, she said excitedly. A family dinner? I repeated, unsure. Yeah, she said. Like the old days. Just us. I think it'd be good for all of us to, connect again. I hesitated, glancing toward the kitchen where Clara was busying herself with meaningless tasks. Okay, I said finally. Let's do it. Sophie beamed, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a spark of her usual joy. But as I watched her, a plan began to form in my mind. This dinner would be the perfect stage. The perfect moment to bring the truth into the light. Clara and Evan thought they'd escape the consequences. They were wrong. Sophie threw herself into planning the family dinner with the kind of enthusiasm only a teenager could muster. She wanted everything to be perfect, the food, the table settings, the atmosphere. I admired her effort, even as my heart ached knowing what was coming. Clara seemed nervous about the whole thing, though she tried to hide it behind a forced smile. Her hands trembled slightly as she helped Sophie arrange the dishes on the table. She avoided my gaze the entire time, likely sensing the tension that hung in the air. The clock struck 7, and the three of us sat down at the dining table for what Sophie hoped would be a healing moment for our fractured family. The scent of roasted chicken and freshly baked rolls filled the air, but the warmth of the meal couldn't mask the chill between Clara and me. So, Sophie began brightly, her smile almost too big. This is nice, isn't it? Just us, like old times. It is, Clara said, her voice soft. You did a wonderful job, sweetheart. Sophie grinned. Thanks, Mom. Dad helped too. I nodded, forcing a small smile. It's good to be together. Clara glanced at me, her lips pressing into a thin line. She knew I was holding back, but she had no idea just how much. For a while, the conversation stayed light. Sophie talked about school, her friends, and a new art project she was excited about. Clara chimed in occasionally, though her responses were clipped, and her smiles never quite reached her eyes. But I couldn't stay silent forever. Sophie, I said after a lull in the conversation, can you do me a favor and grab the dessert from the kitchen? She looked confused but nodded. Sure. Be right back. As soon as she was out of earshot, I turned to Clara. Her eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. What are you doing? She whispered, her voice trembling. I think it's time for the truth, I said coldly. Ryan, no, she said, her voice urgent. Not here. Not like this. Why not? I asked, my tone sharp. You've been hiding in the shadows for months. Don't you think it's time Sophie knows who you really are? Her face crumpled, tears brimming in her eyes. Please, she begged. Don't do this. Before I could respond, Sophie returned, carrying a tray of chocolate cake and ice cream. She paused, sensing the tension between us. Everything okay? She asked, her gaze darting between us. Actually, I said, my voice steady, there's something we need to talk about. Ryan, Clara said sharply, her voice breaking. No, I said, my gaze locking on hers. No more lies. Sophie set the tray down slowly, her brow furrowed. What's going on? I took a deep breath, my chest tight with the weight of what I was about to say. Sophie, I began carefully. You know how much I love you, right? She nodded, her confusion deepening. And you know I've always tried to be honest with you, no matter what. Her nod was slower this time, her eyes searching mine. What are you talking about, Dad? I glanced at Clara, who was frozen in place, her face pale. Then I looked back at Sophie. There's something you need to know. Something about Evan. Sophie stiffened at the mention of his name. What about him? He wasn't who you thought he was, I said gently. He wasn't just your boyfriend, Sophie. He was seeing your mother. The room fell silent, the weight of my words crashing down like a tidal wave. Sophie's eyes widened, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. No, she said, shaking her head. That's not true. That can't be true. It is, I said, my voice heavy. I didn't want you to find out like this, but I couldn't keep it from you any longer. She turned to Clara, her voice trembling. Mom? Is it true? Clara opened her mouth, but no words came out. Tears streamed down her face as she finally nodded. I'm so sorry, she whispered. Sophie stumbled back, her hands covering her mouth. How could you? She choked out, her voice breaking. How could you do this to me? To us? Sophie, please. Clara pleaded, standing to reach for her, but Sophie recoiled as if burned. Don't touch me, Sophie shouted, her tears falling freely now. You're disgusting. Both of you. She ran from the room, her footsteps echoing through the house as she slammed her bedroom door. The silence that followed was deafening. Clara collapsed into her chair, sobbing uncontrollably, but I felt nothing for her. You did this, I said coldly. You and Evan. And now you'll deal with the fallout. Clara looked up at me, her eyes filled with anguish. I never wanted this, she whispered. But you chose it, I replied. And now it's over. I left her there, her sobs fading behind me as I climbed the stairs to Sophie's room. I knocked gently on her door. Sophie, it's me. Can I come in? For a moment there was no response. Then, her voice came, muffled and broken. Go away. I'm not leaving, I said softly. Not until I know you're okay. The door creaked open a crack, and I saw her tear-streaked face peeking out. I hate her, she said, her voice trembling. I know, I said, pulling her into a hug. I know, sweetheart. But I'm here, and I'll never leave you. I promise. Her sobs racked her body as I held her, my heart breaking for the pain she didn't deserve. Clara and Evan thought they'd only hurt me. But now, they'd have to face what they'd done to Sophie. The days after the dinner were a storm I couldn't control. Sophie barely left her room. Her once lively demeanor was replaced with silence, her laughter extinguished by the betrayal of the two people she trusted most. She only spoke to me in short sentences, and when Clara tried to approach her, Sophie would slam the door or shout for her to leave. Clara, meanwhile, walked through the house like a shadow. She was a shell of the woman I once knew, her guilt eating away at her with every passing hour. But I felt no pity for her. Her tears couldn't undo what she'd done to Sophie, or to me. The final blow came when Sophie refused to have Clara drive her to school. Dad, she said one morning, standing by the front door, her backpack slung over her shoulder. Can you take me? I don't want to be in the car with her. Clara stood in the hallway, her face crumpling at Sophie's words. Sophie, please. Don't talk to me. Sophie snapped, her voice trembling with anger. I stepped between them, shielding Sophie from Clara's tearful gaze. Let's go, I said, ushering her out the door. As I drove Sophie to school, I tried to find the right words to comfort her. Sophie, I said gently, I know this is hard. You don't deserve any of this. Why did she do it? She asked suddenly, her voice raw with emotion. Why would she hurt us like this? I don't understand. I don't understand either, I admitted, gripping the steering wheel tightly. But what I do know is that you're not to blame for any of it. This is on her and Evan, not you. She nodded, staring out the window. I don't think I can ever forgive her. You don't have to, I said. Not now, maybe not ever. That's your choice. But I promise you, I'll always be here for you. She turned to me, her eyes brimming with tears. Thanks, Dad. I reached over and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. We'll get through this. Together. Back at home, the tension reached a boiling point. Clara had cornered me in the kitchen after Sophie left for school, her face etched with desperation. Ryan, she began, her voice shaking. I need to talk to you. I have nothing to say to you, I replied coldly, brushing past her. You can't keep shutting me out, she cried, grabbing my arm. I turned to face her, my anger barely contained. You destroyed this family, Clara. You betrayed me. You betrayed Sophie. What more do you want me to say? I want to fix this, she shouted, tears streaming down her face. I know I messed up, but I love you, Ryan. I love Sophie. Please give me a chance to make things right. I shook my head, disgusted by her audacity. You don't get to fix this, Clara. You had your chance, and you chose to throw it away, for him. Her sobs grew louder as she sank to her knees, pleading with me. I'll do anything. Just tell me what to do. I'll cut Evan off completely. I'll go to therapy, anything. Just don't give up on us. There is no us anymore, I said, my voice hard. You made sure of that. Clara collapsed against the counter, her body shaking with sobs. I watched her for a moment, my heart cold to her pain. Then I turned and left the room. That evening, Mark, Clara's brother, showed up unannounced. He'd been furious when I told him the truth about what his sister had done, but now he wanted answers from her directly. She needs to explain herself, he said as he stepped inside, his jaw tight. I can't believe she'd do something like this to you, or to Sophie. She's not exactly in a state to talk, I said bitterly. She better get in one, Mark replied, striding toward the living room where Clara sat, staring blankly at the television. Clara, he said sharply, his voice cutting through the silence. She flinched, turning to see her brother standing there. Mark? What are you doing here? I'm here because Ryan told me everything, he said, his tone cold. I need to hear it from you. Tell me this isn't true. Tell me you didn't destroy your family over some boy. Clara's face crumpled as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. I made a mistake, she whispered. A mistake? Mark repeated, his voice rising. Clara, this isn't forgetting to lock the door or burning dinner. You betrayed your husband and your daughter. What the hell were you thinking? I wasn't thinking, she sobbed. I was lonely, and Evan, he made me feel special. Like I mattered. You mattered to your family, Mark shouted. To Ryan. To Sophie. But you threw that away, didn't you? Clara buried her face in her hands, unable to respond. Mark turned to me, his face tight with fury. You don't owe her anything, he said. If I were you, I'd kick her out today. I'm working on it, I replied, my voice cold. Mark nodded, his anger simmering just below the surface. If you need anything at all, you call me. Got it? Thanks, Mark, I said. With one last glare at Clara, he left, slamming the door behind him. Clara sat in the living room, her sobs echoing through the house. But I felt nothing. Her tears were too little, too late. The next day, I met with my lawyer to finalize the divorce paperwork. The evidence I'd gathered, text messages, security footage, and Clara's own confessions, left no room for her to argue. The settlement would be on my terms, and I would fight for full custody of Sophie. When I returned home, I handed Clara the papers without a word. Her hands trembled as she took them, her eyes scanning the documents. You're really doing this? She said, her voice hollow. Yes, I replied. You gave me no choice. She looked up at me, her face a mask of despair. What about Sophie? She stays with me, I said firmly. She deserves stability, and you're not capable of giving her that. Clara's tears began anew, but I didn't stay to watch. I walked upstairs to Sophie's room, knocking gently before entering. Hey, kiddo, I said softly. How are you holding up? She shrugged, sitting cross-legged on her bed. I don't know. It still hurts. I know, I said, sitting beside her. But we're going to be okay. You and me. We'll get through this together. She leaned her head against my shoulder, her voice small. Promise? Promise, I said, wrapping my arm around her. Clara's choices had shattered our family, but Sophie and I would rebuild. And we'd do it without her. The house felt quieter after I handed Clara the divorce papers. She didn't fight them, nor did she try to argue for more time with Sophie. It seemed like she knew she had no ground to stand on. Over the next few weeks, Clara packed her things and moved into a small apartment across town. She'd requested joint custody during the process, but I fought for Sophie's well-being and was granted full custody with supervised visitation. Sophie didn't say much about her mother's departure. On the day Clara left, Sophie stayed in her room, refusing to come out even to say goodbye. I didn't press her. She deserved to process this in her own time and in her own way. When Clara finally walked out the door for the last time, the weight of her absence felt like a strange relief. For the first time in months, the house felt lighter, even in its silence. The weeks turned into months, and Sophie and I began to rebuild our lives. It wasn't easy. There were nights when the grief and betrayal hung in the air like a heavy fog. Sophie still had moments where she would break down, her tears a reminder of how deeply her mother's actions had cut her. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, Sophie finally opened up. "Do you think Mom regrets what she did?" she asked suddenly, her voice quiet. I set the dish I was washing back into the sink, turning to face her. "I think she does," I said carefully. "But that doesn't change what happened." Sophie nodded, her brow furrowed. "I just don't get it. If she loved us, why would she do something like that?" I sighed, pulling out a chair to sit beside her. "Sometimes, people make selfish choices, Sophie. They think about what they want in the moment, and don't stop to think about how it will hurt the people they love. It doesn't mean you weren't enough or that she didn't love you. It just means she made a terrible mistake." She stared at the table, her fingers tracing patterns on the surface. "Do you think I'll ever forgive her?" "That's up to you," I said gently. Forgiveness isn't about letting someone off the hook, it's about giving yourself peace. But it takes time, and you don't have to force it. She looked up at me, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. I don't know if I can. And that's okay, I said, pulling her into a hug. You don't have to figure it all out right now. Just take it one step at a time. As time passed, Sophie began to heal. She threw herself into her schoolwork and her art, channeling her emotions into beautiful paintings and sketches that filled the walls of our home. I encouraged her every step of the way, attending every school event and cheering her on from the sidelines. I found myself healing too. The anger and betrayal that had consumed me for so long began to fade, replaced by a quiet determination to give Sophie the stability and love she deserved. One afternoon, as we sat on the back porch watching the sunset, Sophie turned to me with a small smile. I like it better this way, she said. What do you mean? I asked. Just us, she replied. It feels safe. Her words filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in months. It's always going to be safe, I promised. You're my number one priority, Sophie. Always. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a sense of peace. Clara tried to mend her relationship with Sophie in the months that followed, but Sophie kept her at arm's length. Their supervised visits were brief and strained, with Sophie refusing to open up to her mother. Clara's guilt was evident, but it wasn't enough to undo the damage she had caused. Evan, on the other hand, disappeared from our lives entirely. I heard through the grapevine that his reputation had taken a hit after I'd shared some key pieces of evidence with his family. He'd lost their support and moved out of town, likely to escape the shame. As for me, I let him go. My revenge wasn't about dragging him through the mud, it was about reclaiming the life he and Clara had tried to destroy. And now, I had that life back. 1 year later, on a crisp autumn evening, Sophie and I stood in the backyard, stringing up lights for a small celebration. It was her 17th birthday, and she'd asked for something simple, just a few friends, some good food, and time with her dad. As we worked, she glanced over at me, a mischievous glint in her eye. Think you'll ever date again, Dad? I chuckled, shaking my head. I don't know. Maybe someday. You should, she said firmly. You deserve to be happy too. Her words stayed with me long after the party ended. Sophie had grown stronger over the past year, her resilience shining through in ways that made me prouder than I could ever express. If she could find joy again after everything she'd been through, maybe I could too. For now, though, I was content. Content with the quiet, the stability, and the bonds Sophie and I had rebuilt from the wreckage. Clara's choices had broken our family, but they hadn't broken us. We were stronger than she ever gave us credit for. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about the future. If you want more stories like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.